At his own son's wedding in Napa Valley, Richard Hale, 64, was paraded before the bride's wealthy family as nothing more than a broke, failed father who patched up old books to survive. The words sliced through the air like a blade, stripping him of dignity in front of hundreds. Gasps, laughter under breath, and the smirk on his son's face turned a proud father into a public spectacle. Yet Richard stood silent, because hidden beneath his calm eyes was a secret powerful enough to shatter the room. What happened next, no one could have predicted. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. Richard sat at table 19, the farthest corner of the glittering hall, where the chandeliers sprayed gold light across every face but his. The music swelled, glasses clinked, waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and yet he might as well have been invisible. Table 19 was not chosen at random. It was deliberate, a quiet exile, a seat meant to erase him from the celebration. He looked down at the folded card with his name in careful cursive placed neatly beside silver cutlery he wasn't meant to touch. Around him the air shimmered with laughter, but every sound felt like it was made at his expense. Across the room the bride's family gathered in a glowing cluster, all pearls and pressed tuxedos. Their eyes slid toward him with practiced indifference, the kind that acknowledges existence only to dismiss it. One of them whispered something behind a manicured hand, and the ripple of polite laughter that followed burned hotter than open mockery. A younger cousin of the bride, barely 30, strolled by with a swagger, looked down at him, and offered a nod that carried no respect. It was the nod you give a valet who parked your car, not the man who raised the groom. The shrimp cocktail on his plate sweated under the lights untouched. He sipped from his water, the glass trembling just enough to betray the storm under his skin. He adjusted his tie, a navy silk Clara had given him years ago, and felt the weight of her absence. If she had been alive, no one would have dared put him in that chair. She had been the fire, the shield, the undeniable presence that demanded acknowledgement. Without her, he was seen as nothing more than a relic stripped of power, easy to sideline. From table 19, he had the perfect vantage point of humiliation. Michael stood tall at the head table, flanked by Emily's parents. His son's laughter was polished, his smile sharpened for the occasion, every gesture rehearsed for approval. Not once did his eyes drift toward the corner where his father sat. When a toast was raised in his honor, Michael's glass clinked high in the air, but the reflection in the crystal never reached his father's lonely seat. Richard felt the heat rise in his chest, not from anger alone, but from the betrayal of a bond he had once believed unbreakable. A waiter approached with a forced smile and leaned down, almost whispering as if ashamed to be overheard. "Sir, would you like me to bring you another option?" The bride requested some of the entrees be limited for the main tables. Richard blinked at him, stunned, then nodded slowly. Even the menu had been rationed, his meal a watered-down version of what the others enjoyed. He glanced at the main tables where filet mignon and lobster tails were being carved into glistening perfection, while his plate was marked with a slice of dry chicken and a single sprig of parsley. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was the quiet, surgical kind, each cut so precise it barely drew blood until he realized he was bleeding from everywhere. He caught sight of Emily's father, Robert, leaning close to Michael with a grin too wide, a hand on his shoulder as if guiding him toward some invisible future that excluded the man at table 19. Richard read their body language like a ledger number stacked against him, calculations already made. He imagined their voices behind closed doors speaking of legacy, of wealth, of bloodlines cleansed of embarrassment. He excused himself for airwalking the length of the hall with measured steps. Each polished shoe clicked against marble as eyes trailed after him. He pushed open a door to the terrace where night stretched wide over the vineyard. The cool California air struck his face, and for a moment he let his shoulders sag. Out there, under the distant hum of cicadas and the faint rustle of grapevines, he allowed himself to feel the sting fully. His son had cast him out not with words alone, but with every detail of the evening. Placement, meal, company, silence. Richard lit a cigarette he hadn't touched in years. The smoke curled upward like ghosts from another lifetime. Memories of Clara laughing on summer nights, of Michael, as a boy running through their backyard with grass stains on his knees, shouting that his dad was the strongest man in the world. He inhaled deep, coughed once, and flicked the ash over the railing. The vineyard below shimmered with rows of vines stretching into darkness endless and unyielding. He stared out as if the earth itself was listening, as if Clara's spirit still lingered in the soil beneath. When he returned inside, nothing had changed. The music-pulsed guests swayed under fairy lights, and his chair waited like a reminder of exile. He sat again, slower this time, watching as Emily's mother stood to give her speech. Every word praised her daughter's brilliance, her elegance, her future. She turned to Michael with a smile that claimed him as one of their own. Not once did she glance toward the corner, toward the man who had raised him single-handedly after Clara's passing. Richard's throat tightened, but he forced the lump down with a swallow of water that tasted like ash. Then came the moment that cut deeper than the rest. Michael, smiling wide, rose with microphone in hand. His speech, rehearsed and polished, drew applause and laughter. But in its rhythm, in its polish, Richard heard something missing. There was no mention of sacrifice. No acknowledgement of the nights his father had worked double shifts to keep the lights on. No gratitude for the man who sold his rare books to pay tuition, who stood in the rain at every Little League game. Instead, Michael leaned into the role he had scripted for himself, a man who had risen from nothing, who had carved success from the void. His words painted Richard as the void itself. Applause thundered across the hall. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, whistling. At table 19, Richard clapped once, then let his hands fall. He could feel the sting of humiliation burning into bone. His face was calm, his posture straight, but inside he was building something brick by brick. Every insult laid another stone. Every dismissal added mortar. He was constructing not revenge born of rage, but a lesson etched in steel. His silence was not surrender. It was calculation. A child at a nearby table turned to look at him, eyes curious, innocent. For a moment, Richard saw himself reflected there, the father he once was, the man who believed kindness was enough. Then the child was pulled away, attention lost, and Richard was left staring at his hands. They no longer trembled. They were steady, strong, purposeful. The evening stretched on each minute thick with the weight of his isolation. He endured the clatter of forks, the endless laughter, the self-congratulation of families congratulating themselves. He endured because endurance was his inheritance, the one thing no one could strip away. But even as he sat in that corner, the seed planted earlier began to take root. His son had forgotten that blood runs deeper than gold, that the past cannot be erased with a well-rehearsed speech. When dessert was served, Richard pushed the plate aside untouched. He had no appetite for sweetness in a room so bitter. He folded his napkin carefully, set it atop the plate, and looked one last time toward the head table. His eyes lingered on Michael, smiling with his new family, unaware of the storm gathering in the quiet corner of the hall. Richard leaned back, exhaling slowly. His humiliation had been public, deliberate, sharpened to break him. But what none of them knew was that he carried something far heavier than their judgment, something he had guarded in silence for years. That silence was about to end, and when it did, the laughter in that hall would never sound the same again. Richard sat in the dim glow of the reception hall, the chandelier's crystals scattering light across tables filled with laughter and wine. At table 19, his glass stood half empty, the water inside trembling faintly as if echoing the storm within him. His son's voice still rang in his ears, sharp and public, a blade disguised as a joke, branding him as nothing but a poor, failed man before strangers in tailored suits. Yet in that moment of humiliation, his mind betrayed him, dragging him backward through the years, into a world where Michael was still his boy, and where pride flowed easily between them. He remembered a Saturday morning when Michael was 10, their old house filled with the smell of ink and paper. Richard had been bent over a torn atlas, patching the spine with steady hands, while Michael sat cross-legged on the floor, crayons scattered like treasure. The boy had held up a drawing with both hands, his smile wide enough to light the whole room. "This is my dad," Michael had said, beaming. The picture showed a man with broad shoulders holding a giant book stitched together with glowing lines as though each page healed the world itself. His teacher had written in red ink at the top, "My hero fixes stories." Richard had folded that paper, placed it in a box he kept in the closet, and carried it like a hidden medal of honor. Now, years later, those same words felt like a knife twisted in his chest. His son had taken that pride, reshaped it into disdain, discarded it as though it meant nothing. Richard's breath came heavy, his chest tight. Across the room, Michael laughed with Emily's family, his hand resting confidently on his new wife's back, his posture tall, his voice commanding. He looked like a man proud to have erased his origins, proud to rewrite the story, without the father who raised him. And Richard felt in the sharpest clarity that he had not just lost his son to marriage, but to shame. The pain unfolded memory after memory, each one more ruthless than the last. He remembered Michael's first day of high school, his nervous hands tugging at a too large backpack. Richard had walked him to the bus stop, ignoring the rolled eyes of other teenagers, ignoring his son's plea not to come. When the bus pulled away, he had stood on the corner until it vanished, whispering a silent prayer that his boy would never feel alone. He had worked double shifts to buy Michael's first car, an old Chevy with rust creeping at the edges, but to Michael at 16 it had been freedom. That summer night when the boy had come home with friends piled in the back, laughing too loud, music shaking the windows, Richard had said nothing. He had just smiled, proud that his son finally felt he belonged somewhere. Those memories clashed violently with the sight before him now. Michael standing taller by dismissing his father. Michael building his identity not on gratitude, but on rejection. Richard's fingers clenched against the tablecloth, the linen crumpling under his grip. He could hear Clara's voice in the back of his mind, her gentle laugh on quiet evenings, her words that had once steadied him. A son carries his father's name until the day he earns his own. Don't let him forget who gave him the chance. But Michael had forgotten. Worse, he had chosen to forget. Richard realized this was not a mistake or a slip of the tongue. It was a decision, a clean break, a deliberate burial of the man who had built his foundation. The betrayal burned hotter than any wound life had dealt him before. Losing Clara to illness had gutted him, but this felt like erasure, as though he had died too. But his body hadn't been given the courtesy of a grave. The band began to play another waltz, couples gliding across the polished floor. Richard caught a glimpse of Michael spinning Emily, their faces painted in joy. He wanted to believe, even for a heartbeat, that beneath the surface his son remembered the nights spent reading by the fireplace, the Saturdays fixing shelves together the way Richard's hands had carried him through sickness, fear, and youth. But the expression on Michael's face left no room for doubt. It was the expression of a man who had chosen new blood, a new legacy, a new life where his father had no seat at the table. The ache in Richard's chest twisted into something darker, sharper. It wasn't just sorrow now. It was realization. He had raised his son to believe that compassion, sacrifice, and loyalty would be enough to hold them together. But compassion had turned into weakness in Michael's eyes, sacrifice into shame, loyalty into chains to be broken. He had raised a son who had confused love with limitation, who believed that to rise he must first sever the root that fed him. Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed but unfocused, as if staring through the walls of the hall into the years behind them. He remembered the night he stayed up mending Michael's essay that had been torn to shreds by bullies. He had taped it back together, ironed the creases, and told his son, "Words are stronger when they survive being broken." Michael had smiled. Then his young face lit with admiration, his small fingers clutching his father's larger hand. That boy, that moment, was nowhere to be found now. Instead, before him stood a man who had traded admiration for calculation, who had decided his father's legacy was nothing but dead weight. The crowd erupted in applause again, glasses raised high, the sound echoing like distant thunder. Richard remained still, his own hands resting on the table, unmoved, unreadable. The sadness that had crushed him minutes ago now hardened into resolve. Every humiliation tonight had been designed to make him vanish quietly, to make him accept his role as the forgotten father in the corner. But Richard Hale was not a man who vanished. Not when the stakes were this high. Not when his own blood had turned his back so coldly. The music faded, replaced by the clatter of cutlery and the hum of shallow conversation. Richard lifted his glass, sipped once more, and set it down with deliberate calm. He knew what had been lost. He knew Michael no longer saw him as the father who healed stories, but as the story that needed to be erased. And in that clarity, Richard found something stronger than grief. He found direction. For the first time that night, his lips curled into the faintest shadow of a smile. It wasn't warm. It wasn't forgiving. It was the smile of a man who had accepted the truth and begun to shape what would come next. Because Richard still carried something Michael had never known, something he had kept buried deep behind years of silence and sacrifice. And when the time came to reveal it, the son who thought he had rewritten the story would discover just how wrong he was. Richard's eyes lingered on the glowing ballroom, the laughter, the crystal glasses raised like symbols of triumph, but he wasn't really there. His mind had slipped into the quiet shadows of memory, into the hospital room where Clara had spoken her last words. The sterile white walls, the slow, uneven beeping of the monitor, the way her hand had felt in his thin, fragile, yet still powerful enough to hold his world together. He could still smell the faint trace of lavender on her pillow, still see the soft determination etched into her face, even as her body failed her. She had looked at him, eyes sharp despite the pain, and whispered words that had burrowed into his very bones. Be the compass for our son Richard, even if it means guiding him through the storm, even if it means being the storm. Sometimes love isn't about protecting. Sometimes it's about teaching the lesson no one else will. That memory struck him now like thunder under his skin. Clara had always seen further than he did. She knew Michael's hunger for approval, his weakness for image, his blind spot where ambition turned cruel. She had predicted this very moment in some unspoken way, had prepared Richard for the inevitability that their son might forget where he came from. And she had given him the burden of choice. Let Michael's arrogance destroy him or remind him that the foundation he stood on was built by the hands of a man he now scorned. The echo of her voice was not gentle anymore. It was a command sharp and unyielding. Richard sat straighter in his chair, his humiliation hardening into something sharper, something cold and precise. He could almost see Clara across the table watching him with that mixture of tenderness and expectation. She had never been one for weakness. Even when her body betrayed her, her will had remained iron. Now in the middle of a hall where he was meant to feel erased, Richard felt her presence like a fire reigniting inside him. He remembered her last weeks, the way she'd tried to prepare him. She had gathered papers in neat envelopes, whispered instructions in moments when Michael wasn't listening. She had known her son's flaws better than Richard had wanted to admit. Don't let him mistake kindness for weakness, she had told him one night, her voice a rasp, but her meaning sharp as glass. If he forgets who you are, if he forgets who he is, you remind him. You remind him in a way he'll never recover from. Richard had promised her then, his lips against her knuckles, his chest tight with grief. And now, years later, that promise was no longer a memory. It was an obligation. As he watched Michael laughing with Emily's father, Richard felt the weight of that vow pressing down on him. He thought of all the times he had chosen silence when he should have spoken, all the moments he had softened when he should have sharpened. Clara had warned him Michael would take silence as surrender, and tonight, surrounded by people who treated him like a ghost at his own son's celebration, Richard finally understood the cost of his restraint. The music swelled, another toast rose, and still no one looked his way. But beneath the noise, Richard could hear something else, Clara's voice steady, unwavering. A compass doesn't beg to be followed. It simply points north. And if he refuses to see it, you let him get lost until he realizes he needs you to find his way back. The words curled around him not as comfort, but as armor. He imagined Clara standing beside him, Her eyes narrowed, daring him not to act. He could almost feel her hand pressing his shoulder, steadying him the way she used to when he hesitated over difficult choices. She had always been the strategist, the one who saw the shape of battles before they began. Richard had been the muscle, the endurance, the steady hands that built and carried. But together, they had balanced one another, and now her absence was no excuse. He was not alone. He still carried her strategy in his veins. His gaze swept the room, not with bitterness now, but with assessment. Every detail sharpened into focus, the smug tilt of Robert's head as he whispered in Michael's ear, the way Emily's mother gestured toward him like he was some unfortunate footnote, the careful avoidance of eyes that didn't want to meet his. They thought they had written him out of the script. They had no idea Clara had left him with a different ending, one they could never predict. Richard's humiliation cooled into resolve, a slow-burning ember that would not be extinguished. He thought of the documents Clara had hidden, the investments she had made quietly, the backup plans she had hinted at but never fully revealed. She had trusted him to know when to use them. That time was not just approaching, it had arrived. Tonight was not about saving his pride. It was about honoring the promise he had made in a hospital room when the woman he loved most had trusted him with the future of their son. The chatter in the hall blurred into a dull roar. He saw only Michael now, the boy who had once beamed with pride over a crayon drawing, the boy who now stood tall by pretending his father was nothing. Richard's jaw tightened. Clara's words carved themselves into his heart once again. Sometimes love is the strike that leaves the scar he will never forget. Richard lifted his glass not in a toast, but as a silent ritual, a signal to the memory of his wife. His reflection in the liquid showed not a broken man, but a man sharpening a lining, becoming the compass she had told him to be. When he set the glass down, his hand was steady, his pulse calm. The decision had been made. The chandeliers glimmered above him. The music spun on, and Michael's laughter carried through the hall. But Richard no longer heard it the way he had before. It wasn't the sound of betrayal anymore. It was the sound of an opening, the signal of the moment Clara had prepared him for. The vow he had made on her deathbed pulsed in his veins like a drumbeat, guiding him forward. And as he looked once more at his son surrounded by borrowed approval and fragile power, Richard felt the weight of destiny settle over him. The lesson Clara had demanded would be taught. It would not be kind. It would not be forgettable. And it would not wait. Richard had stepped away from the suffocating chatter of Table 19, weaving through the crowded hall with the steady gait of a man who needed air more than company. His chest felt heavy, his ears ringing with Clara's words, her charge still burning in his veins. He had promised her he would be the compass, even if it meant pointing his son through the storm. But the storm had only begun. He passed through a narrow corridor that led toward the side terrace, the muffled hum of voices drifting from the alcove just ahead. He hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't planned to linger. But then he heard his son's voice, low, confident, sharpened with the arrogance of someone who believed the world had already crowned him. Richard froze his hand against the cool wall, every muscle in his body locked. Michael's tone was different here, stripped of the polished charm he wore at the head table. It was raw, unguarded, the kind of voice a man uses when he believes no one else is listening. She married into nothing. Michael was saying, his words clipped, deliberate. He's just an old man, patching books, clinging to scraps. No ambition, no vision. I've carried his dead weight my whole life, and tonight proves I don't have to anymore. He's a failure, Mother. A pathetic failure. The words hit Richard like gunfire, each syllable tearing through the armor he had built from years of sacrifice. He stood still, the pulse in his neck hammering his mouth dry. His son's voice, the same voice that once called him a hero, now sliced him apart without hesitation. He had braced himself for disrespect, for distance, for the cool neglect of a man too consumed by his own image. But this was something far crueler. This was not absence. This was denial. From the alcove he heard the delicate murmur of Emily's mother, gracious, approving, laced with pity that wasn't aimed at Michael, but at the father he had just reduced to nothing. "Well," she said with a tone of relief, "you'll have us now. You don't need to worry about appearances anymore. We'll guide you forward. Your family." Richard's jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack. His stomach twisted, bile rising with the taste of betrayal. Family. The word had been ripped from his hands, transferred like a gift to strangers who measured worth in status and appearances. The woman's voice was warm, almost maternal, and yet to Richard it sounded like a lock clicking shut, as though his son had traded him away for acceptance at a shinier table. He remembered Michael at 12, furious after losing a spelling bee, throwing his ribbon in the trash. Richard had dug it out, smoothed the crumpled fabric, and told him that failure was just a teacher wearing a cruel mask. "Ambition isn't about the win," he had said, pressing the ribbon back into the boy's palm. "It's about the fight you give before the end." Michael had nodded, then eyes wide, swallowing every word as if they were gospel. And yet here he was, grown, dismissing the very man who had planted those truths, branding him as ambitionless as nothing. The voices in the alcove drifted into laughter, a quiet agreement sealed between them. Richard pressed his back to the wall, his breath controlled but his hands trembled at his sides. He had faced lost sickness, years of scraping together enough to keep his son's dreams alive, and never once had he faltered. He had fought storms Michael would never understand, cut his own hands open to build a future strong enough for another man to stand on. And now that man, his own blood, had cast his life's work aside, as though it were dust on his shoes. It wasn't the insult that destroyed him. It was the recognition. His son didn't just want to bury the past, he wanted to erase the man who had carried him through it. That realization hollowed him, left him standing in that hallway as if every bone had been stripped of strength. Clara's words echoed again, louder now, demanding he become what she had charged him to be. But even her memory could not soften this moment. This wasn't just betrayal. It was annihilation. Richard turned away before they could see him, his face locked in stone. He walked down the hall, each step measured the sound of his shoes against marble, steady, despite the storm raging inside him. The reception hall roared with music when he re-entered, violins and laughter rising in a blur of noise. To everyone else the evening was a celebration. To Richard it had become a reckoning. He returned to table 19, lowering himself into the chair that might as well have been a throne of exile. He didn't touch the glass in front of him. He didn't taste the food. He sat in silence, the weight of his son's words still clinging to him like smoke from a fire that hadn't gone out. He thought of Clara again, her eyes narrowing when she spoke of Michael's pride, her quiet warning that love might someday require cruelty. For the first time he understood exactly what she meant. Michael had chosen to bury him alive, to turn his legacy into ash. But Richard had not lived 6 decades to be discarded like a broken tool. He had not built a life with Clara, buried her with promises, and carried those promises like chains only to let his son rewrite the ending. He could feel it now, sharp and certain, a shift inside him that could never be undone. He lifted his gaze to the head table where Michael leaned close to Emily, her family circling him like wolves who believed they had claimed a prize. Richard's expression didn't flicker. His humiliation was gone, burned clean by something far more dangerous. The lesson Clara had asked of him was no longer a choice. It was inevitability. And as the night dragged on, as speeches rang and music swelled, Richard sat quietly in the corner, knowing that what his son had said in secret would soon demand a response so public it would carve itself into memory forever. Richard sat at table 19, the sound of his son's voice still echoing in his head, like a wound that refused to close. Failure. Pathetic. Dead weight. Each word had been a hammer striking against decades of sacrifice, but instead of breaking him, it forged something harder. The humiliation had burned away, leaving only steel. He could feel the shift in his body, in the way his hands no longer trembled, in the way his breathing steadied. For the first time that night, he was not the man being erased. He was the man preparing to write the next chapter, and it would not be kind. His gaze cut across the hall, passing over the glitter of champagne glasses, the polished laughter of strangers, the fragile performance of family unity. Every detail of the evening, every calculated slight, every deliberate act of exclusion now served as fuel. He replayed them in his mind not with bitterness, but with a cold clarity that made his purpose undeniable. Clara's voice was there, too steady and unwavering, reminding him of the promise he had made. He would not let their son destroy his own soul by feeding it lies and arrogance. If Michael had chosen to sever blood for image, then Richard would be the hand that showed him the cost. He straightened his tie, the same one Clara had given him years ago, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of her perfume. It felt like armor now. Around him the party carried on oblivious. The string quartet drifted into another polished melody. Couples swayed under chandeliers, and Michael basked in the glow of borrowed admiration. Richard's eyes narrowed, his silence no longer passive but tactical. He had been underestimated, and there was a power in that. They thought him small, thought him powerless, thought him defeated. They would learn how dangerous a man becomes when stripped of everything but resolve. He thought of the years behind him, of nights spent binding books in his study while Michael slept soundly upstairs. He thought of the library he built with his own hands, shelves, carved floors, polished a space meant to carry stories forward. Michael had seen it as nothing more than the labor of a small man clinging to scraps, but Richard knew better. That library, those books that craft it, had been discipline, legacy, and survival. It had taught him patience, precision, and how to rebuild what others thought broken. And now, sitting in the corner of a hall filled with people who mocked him, he understood that those same skills would guide him again. The pain was still there, but it no longer hollowed him. It sharpened him. He remembered Michael as a boy standing in the doorway of his study, asking why he spent so many hours stitching pages. Richard had told him then, because every story deserves to be whole again. That boy had believed him, had smiled with pride. Tonight, that same boy had grown into a man who mocked the very hands that kept his story alive. But Richard knew stories had endings, and he was the one who would decide this one. A waiter approached, hesitant, setting a glass of wine in front of him. Richard lifted it, studied the crimson swirl beneath the light. To others it was just a drink. To him it was a reminder. Blood is thicker than wine, but it can be spilled just as easily. He set the glass down untouched. He didn't need comfort. He needed focus. Across the room, Emily's father leaned in close to Michael, his lips brushing his ear, whispering promises of future ventures, inheritances, connections. Michael nodded eagerly, his eyes alight with the hunger of a man convinced he had stepped into greatness. Richard watched, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. They had no idea that the very foundation they stood on was not theirs to claim. Clara had made sure of that. He had made sure of that. They thought him powerless, but power was rarely loud. True power waited. He rose once, excusing himself from the table, and stepped out onto the terrace. The vineyard stretched into the night, the air sharp with the scent of grapes and soil. He inhaled deeply, letting the cold air slice through the heat inside him. This was the land Clara had loved. The view she had always claimed gave her clarity. Standing there, he felt her again, felt her presence, as if she stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "Don't let him forget," she had said. "If he mocks the roots, remind him the tree can fall." Richard's resolve solidified. He would no longer sit quietly in the shadows of his son's arrogance. He would no longer allow his silence to be mistaken for weakness. He would act, and when he did, Michael would learn that the father he had dismissed as a relic was the very man capable of reshaping his world. The pain of betrayal had transformed into a weapon, one sharper than anger, one more enduring than shame. He stepped back inside his movements, deliberate, his expression unreadable. The guests barely noticed him, lost in their own revelry. But Richard noticed everything. The careless way Emily's mother adjusted her pearl necklace, the smug tilt of Robert's smile, the way Michael held his glass like a trophy. They believed they had already won, that the night belonged to them. Richard knew better. Nights end. Lights dim. Music fades. What remains is truth, and truth had been waiting patiently for its turn. He returned to his chair, sat down with quiet authority, and folded his hands on the table. He no longer felt the sting of isolation. He felt something far greater, the calm before a storm only he could unleash. He thought of Clara once more, her eyes fierce even in frailty, and whispered to himself, unheard by anyone else, "I'll keep my promise." And as he looked again at his son glowing with borrowed pride, Richard knew the time for silence had ended. The lesson would come, and when it did, it would carve itself so deep into Michael's life that neither he nor anyone watching would ever forget it. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, his voice booming above the laughter and clinking glasses. He announced it was time for the father of the groom to speak. The words cut through the air like a summons, and all eyes turned toward the forgotten corner of the hall. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some with curiosity, others with quiet disdain. They expected a timid man to shuffle forward, to stammer through a few sentimental phrases to thank the bride's family for their generosity. They expected humility, maybe even humiliation. What they got instead was something they never saw coming. Richard rose slowly, the scrape of his chair against the marble floor echoing like a blade drawn from its sheath. He straightened his jacket, adjusted the tie Clara had once knotted for him, and began walking toward the stage. The room seemed to still as he moved. His steps were measured, unhurried, yet each one carried the weight of inevitability. Conversations hushed. Laughter faltered. Even the music from the string quartet softened, as if the players sensed the shift in the air. By the time Richard reached the podium, the hall was silent. He stood there for a moment, surveying the crowd, his expression calm but unreadable. His eyes found Michael at the head table, glowing under chandeliers, his bride beside him, her family clustered like a fortress around their prize. Michael's smile was tight, expectant, but his fingers tapped nervously against his glass. He had not expected his father to command the room this way. Richard held his gaze just long enough to remind him that blood sees deeper than any mask. Then he turned to face the crowd. "I was told," Richard began, his voice steady, low, but carrying that tonight I should share memories, that I should speak of joy, of blessings, of gratitude, that I should keep it brief, light, polite. He paused, letting the words settle like dust on polished glass. "But I don't believe in polite lies. Not tonight." A ripple went through the audience, whispers sliding between tables. Emily's mother stiffened in her seat, pearls glinting against her throat. Michael shifted uncomfortably, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small flash drive, holding it up for all to see. Clara left something for this day. A message. A gift. She called it her last truth, and I promised her I would deliver it to our son when the time was right. He gestured toward the staff at the back of the hall. Within seconds, the massive projection screen behind the band flickered to life. The crowd leaned forward, curiosity pulling them in despite themselves. Richard stepped aside, his face cast in shadow as the lights dimmed. The video began. On the screen, Clara appeared fragile but unbroken, filmed in the final weeks of her life. Her hair was thinner, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes burned with unmistakable fire. She sat at her writing desk, the one Richard had built for her, sunlight pouring through the curtains. Her voice, though weakened, carried a clarity that cut straight through the silence of the hall. "If you're watching this," she began, "it means the day has come. Michael, my son, you were born into love. You were raised in sacrifice. Every page of your life has been stitched together by the man you call father. He gave you everything he had, his time, his labor, his soul. And I fear that one day you might forget. I fear you might measure him by the wrong scale, by wealth, by status, by what impresses strangers. If you've done that, then hear me now. You are mistaken." Gasps rose from the crowd, some murmuring in discomfort, others transfixed. Michael's jaw tightened. He tried to glance away, but the image of his mother on the screen held him like chains. Clara continued, her voice gaining strength, as though pulled from beyond. "Your father is not a man of failure. He is a man of endurance. He is a man who built his life not on what glitters, but on what lasts. The roof over your head, the education that carried you here, the very name you wear, all of it is his doing. And if you've dared to stand in this room and call him anything less, then you have shamed not him but yourself." The silence was absolute. Not a fork scraped, not a glass clinked. Clara's words filled every inch of the hall. "Michael," she said, softer now, almost tender. "A father's love can forgive much. But forgiveness is not free. If you have betrayed the man who raised you, if you have chosen pride over truth, then remember this: what he gives, he can also take away. What he builds, he can also dismantle. Your inheritance, your legacy, your future. It is not yours by right. It is yours by his choice. And if you treat him as nothing, then nothing is exactly what you will be left with." The screen went black. The hall erupted into uneasy whispers, chairs shifting, eyes darting between Richard and Michael. Emily's family looked stricken, caught in the glare of a truth they had never anticipated. Michael's face was pale sweat glistening at his temples. Richard stepped back to the podium. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Clara wanted me to remind my son of who he is. Tonight I have kept that promise." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and final. The rest, he added, his gaze locking on Michael, is yet to be decided. He didn't bow. He didn't thank the crowd. He simply turned and walked away from the podium, his shoulders squared, his presence undeniable. The band sat frozen, the guests unsure whether to clap or remain silent. The room was fractured. The celebration cracked open. And in that fracture, Richard felt Clara's hand on his shoulder, her promise fulfilled. But even as he returned to his seat, he knew this was only the beginning. The video had been a strike, but the lesson was not yet complete. His son had been exposed, the mask torn from his face, yet the real reckoning, the one Clara had asked for, was still to come. And when it came, it would not be spoken in whispers or projected on a screen. It would be delivered in a way no one in that hall could ever forget. The ballroom had been carved into silence, every breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. Clara's face still lingered on the screen, her image frozen on the last frame before it went black, her eyes burning with the kind of truth that outlives flesh. The crowd had expected sentiment, a gentle tribute, maybe even a father's clumsy attempt at poetry. Instead, they had been given a reckoning, and now there was no air left in the room. Richard stood motionless at the podium, his hands resting lightly on the wood, his expression carved from stone. Then, with a signal to the staff, the screen flickered back to life. Clara reappeared, and this time her words were not wrapped in tenderness. They carried the weight of thunder, sharp and final. "Michael," she said, her voice steady, unwavering, "your father and I did not spend our lives building scraps. We did not sacrifice only to leave you with debts or pity. We built something far greater than appearances. For 30 years we invested quietly, strategically, away from the eyes that measured us by cars, houses, or tables at weddings. What we built, Michael, is a trust worth $25 million. A collective gasp rippled across the hall. Champagne glasses froze mid-air, forks clattered softly against porcelain. The words hit like shrapnel. Guests who had barely acknowledged Richard now leaned forward, their eyes wide, the scent of sudden wealth thickening the air. Emily's mother clutched the pearls at her throat, her lips parting as if she might protest, but nothing came. Michael's face drained of color, his smug composure cracking at the edges. Clara's gaze from the screen seemed to pierce directly into him. "But understand this," she continued. "This wealth is not your prize. It is not your entitlement. It comes with one condition, the only condition I insisted on. If you dishonor the man who raised you, if you strip him of his dignity in front of others, if you dare to reduce his life to failure for the sake of your pride, then the trust dissolves. Every dollar, every cent will leave your hands forever. It will go instead to the Library of Congress to preserve stories that deserve respect, even if you refuse to respect your own." The reaction was instantaneous. Whispers roared to life like fire on dry grass. 25 million. The number echoed across every table, muttered with disbelief, repeated with awe. Guests turned their heads, stealing glances at Richard, at Michael, at the bride's family, who sat stunned, their perfect facade cracking. Emily's father shifted in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes darting as though recalculating every word he had spoken that evening. At the head table, Michael's hands curled into fists, his face burning crimson. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. This isn't real," he stammered, his voice louder than he intended. She's manipulating you, Dad. You can't believe this. She recorded that when she was sick. She didn't mean it." His eyes darted wildly, looking for allies in the room, but the faces staring back at him were not allies. They were witnesses. Witnesses to his undoing. Richard remained silent, his gaze locked on his son. His stillness was more powerful than fury. Michael's voice cracked as he tried again, but the authority in his tone was gone. "Tell them, Dad. Tell them you don't believe this." But Richard didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken, and it was Clara's voice that carried more weight than any defense Michael could muster. On the screen, Clara's recording continued, her tone cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Michael, if you are standing in a room today surrounded by strangers who applaud your success but ignore the man who gave you life, then know this: you have already failed. Not in business, not in marriage, but in the one duty no man can escape, the duty of honor. And for that I will not leave you rewarded." The video ended once more, the screen falling to black. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the lights. Guests shifted in their seats, unable to meet each other's eyes, as if the weight of Clara's judgment fell on all of them. Emily's mother looked stricken, her lips pressed into a thin line, her earlier smugness gone. Robert's hands tightened around his glass until it threatened to crack. Michael stood trembling, his voice dropping into a whisper meant for no one but his father. "You set this up. You let her do this. You're trying to ruin me." But his words lacked venom. They sounded like the plea of a child cornered by consequences he never thought would come. Richard's silence was unshakable. He lifted his glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it down again with precision. Every move was deliberate calm, the opposite of his son's unraveling. His eyes never left Michael's, and in that gaze was the echo of Clara's promise, the compass, the storm, the lesson. Around the hall, the guests began to murmur again, but their whispers had changed. They were no longer mocking the quiet man in the corner. They were recounting numbers, conditions, betrayal. Some looked at Richard with newfound respect, others with fear. A father who had been invisible minutes ago now towered over the room, not by height or volume, but by truth. Michael lowered himself into his chair, his movements stiff, his face pale with shock. Emily reached for his hand, but he pulled it away, shame twisting his features. The empire he had been building in the eyes of others was collapsing, and it was collapsing in real time under the unflinching gaze of the very people he had tried to impress. Richard leaned slightly forward, his voice finally breaking the silence. Clara's words were clear. "You chose your path tonight, and the path has its cost." His tone was even, but the weight behind it was immovable. The crowd didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They sat in uneasy stillness, understanding they had witnessed something irreversible. The glow of the chandeliers seemed colder now, the sparkle of wine less sweet. The celebration had turned into a stage for truth, and no one in that hall could unhear what had been revealed. Richard returned to his seat at table 19, every step echoing louder than music. He sat down with the dignity they had tried to strip from him, his back straight, his presence undeniable. Across the room his son sat shattered, the future he had paraded for strangers now crumbling into dust. And though the night was far from over, Richard knew this was the beginning of the true lesson, one that would cut deeper than wealth, deeper than pride, deeper than the silence that had been broken. Because what Clara had given him was more than a message. It was a weapon, and the final strike had yet to fall. The hall felt like it had been drained of oxygen. The glittering chandeliers still blazed overhead, the violinists still held their bows poised mid-air, but the life had been sucked from the room. Silence pressed against every wall. a silence so thick it seemed to vibrate with the pounding of hearts. All eyes fixed on the head table where Michael sat frozen, his bride's hand limp in his. For the first time that night, the golden boy's shine had cracked. His face was pale, drained of triumph, his mouth hanging open as though searching for words that refused to come. Emily sat rigid beside him, her smile gone, her body stiff as stone. The pearls at her throat looked suddenly heavy, suffocating. Her fingers twitched once, reaching for her husband's arm, but he didn't notice. His eyes darted frantically across the room, hunting for escape, for a lifeline, for anyone to rescue him from the reality clawing at his chest. But the faces staring back were no longer admiring. They were watchful, assessing, predatory. The room smelled blood. At the far end of the table, Emily's parents sat like statues carved in shock. Her father's jaw was locked, his glass of champagne still suspended inches from his lips. The hand that held it trembled ever so slightly. He had imagined this night as an elevation, a merging of wealth and ambition, his daughter's marriage pulling in a man whose charisma could be polished into status. Now before hundreds, his son-in-law had been revealed not as a rising star, but as a man who had spat on his own blood and shattered the fortune waiting to be claimed. Emily's mother shifted uncomfortably, her face drained of its usual composure. She leaned toward her husband as though whispering might save them, but no sound left her lips. The insult Michael had hurled hours earlier, that his father was a failure, a man of scraps, a relic now twisted in the air like a curse rebounding back on him. Guests who had laughed at Richard's seating placement now stared at the son, and the irony bit sharper than any knife. A man who had branded his father worthless had just obliterated $25 million with a single choice. The whispers began small at first, but growing, the words hissing from table to table like venom. Failure, ungrateful, fool. The same labels Michael had thrown like daggers were now sewn to his own name. Richard remained still seated at table 19, his face carved in quiet strength. He did not gloat. He did not smirk. His silence was heavier than thunder, a silence that turned every glance his way into recognition. He had been dismissed, exiled to the corner, stripped of dignity. Now the same crowd that had sneered at him could barely meet his eyes. Respect, unwilling but undeniable, began to creep into the air around him. Michael tried to rise his chair, scraping back against the marble, the sound slicing through the quiet. His words tumbled out, desperate, cracked. "This isn't fair. This isn't how it's supposed to be. She set me up. You all heard her. She's twisting everything. It's not real." But the panic in his tone betrayed him. No one believed the defense of a man unraveling before their eyes. Emily's hand tightened on his sleeve, but not with comfort, with warning. The look on her face was cold hard. She had married for promise, for standing, for wealth. In an instant, all of it had dissolved. The hall was a tomb of judgment. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the weight of the moment pressing down like stone. The groom, who hours before had been the beacon of ambition, now looked like a boy cornered, stripped of his illusions. The bride's family sat paralyzed, the legacy they had hoped to marry into vanishing before them. And the father they had mocked sat calm and untouchable, his dignity restored not by force, but by truth. One could hear the clatter of a spoon dropped onto china, the faint sigh of someone at the back. The silence was so deep, it magnified every sound, even the racing pulse in Michael's throat. His chest rose and fell too fast, his breathing shallow. He tried to catch Richard's eyes, tried to summon some thread of control, but his father's gaze was unwavering, cool, unbroken. There was no anger in it, no satisfaction, only inevitability. The whispers turned to murmurs, the murmurs to small conversations carried on in corners. Words like disgrace and betrayal floated through the air. A woman at the far table leaned toward her companion and said what others were thinking. If he could treat his own father like that, what loyalty does he have to anyone? The remark spread like fire. Businessmen in suits frowned, calculating. Friends who had once clapped Michael on the back now stared at him with narrowed eyes. Emily's father finally set his glass down, his fingers still trembling. His voice, though low, carried just enough to be heard by those closest. "You've cost us everything." The sentence dropped into the silence like a stone into a pond, ripples spreading outward until the whole room felt its weight. Michael flinched as if struck, his shoulders sagging. Emily pulled her hand away from his arm, folding her fingers tightly in her lap, her face turned toward the floor. Richard sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the spectacle unraveling across the hall. He had not lifted a finger, had not raised his voice. His son had condemned himself with his own words, and the verdict was public, irreversible. It was Clara's lesson come alive, her warning carved into the air for everyone to see. Michael's collapse was not loud. It was not a dramatic outburst or a shouted denial. It was slower, more humiliating. His pride deflated, his posture sank, and his face became a mask of a man who realized too late what he had lost. The chandeliers glimmered above him, cruel in their brilliance, illuminating every crack in the facade he had worked so hard to build. The silence stretched again, deeper this time, until even the waiters froze where they stood. It was the kind of silence that did not invite recovery, the kind that sealed a moment into memory forever. Every heartbeat in that room seemed to echo against the marble walls. The celebration was dead. The wedding had become a courtroom, and the verdict had been delivered. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders steady, his face calm. He knew this was only one part of the lesson. The real reckoning, the one Clara had prepared him to deliver, was still waiting. And when it came, it would leave more than silence. It would leave scars. Richard rose from table 19 with the kind of calm that unsettles more than rage. The marble floor caught the weight of his steps as he walked through the silence past rows of faces that only hours earlier had dismissed him as a relic. Now every eye followed him, not with derision, but with the uneasy awe reserved for men who hold the power to alter the course of a room with nothing but truth. He did not hurry. He did not glance at Michael, who sat collapsed into himself, his bride's hand withdrawn, his in-laws staring at him like he was a stain on silk. Richard's shoulders were straight, his posture unyielding, his very presence reclaiming the dignity they had tried to bury. The air was heavy with the residue of Clara's words, her voice still echoing like scripture. $25 million dissolved into nothing because of one son's arrogance. The crowd shifted in their chairs, whispering in tones that carried no sympathy. Richard reached the doorway at the back of the hall, the golden light of the chandeliers behind him casting his figure in silhouette. For a brief moment he stopped and turned his head, his eyes cutting once more toward the head table. Michael's gaze met his, desperate, broken, searching for forgiveness that would not come. Richard spoke, his voice carrying across the room with the clarity of a blade. Sometimes love is not protection. Sometimes love is the lesson that saves a soul from itself. The words hung in the air, striking harder than any outburst, heavier than any condemnation. Then he turned and walked out, leaving behind the wreckage of a celebration that had transformed into judgment. The doors closed behind him, and the hall erupted into chaos. Guests swarmed in hushed arguments, their voices rising like storm winds. Emily's mother clutched her pearls as if they might choke her, her father's fury simmering just beneath his controlled exterior. The bride's smile was gone, her eyes filled with calculation as she looked at the man she had married, already seeing him differently. Michael's friends avoided his gaze, the loyalty they once wore now evaporating. He sat alone in the wreckage of his choices, stripped bare before the people he had sought to impress. Outside, Richard stepped into the cool night air. The vineyard stretched into darkness, the stars hanging above like watchful eyes. He inhaled deeply, the scent of earth and grapes filling his lungs, steadying him. For the first time in years he felt Clara beside him, not in memory but in presence. He had kept his promise. He had been the compass. He had been the storm. He whispered into the night words meant only for her. "It's done. He'll remember." The truth of the evening would travel far beyond those walls. Guests would carry it home, share it over dinners and phone calls, repeat Clara's words until they became legend. The story would grow reshaped and retold, but always with the same lesson at its core: a father's dignity cannot be erased, and a son's betrayal carries a cost no fortune can cover. Richard knew Michael would feel that weight long after the lights dimmed, long after the music stopped, long after the last guest left the shattered remnants of a wedding turned into a reckoning. Richard walked down the gravel path toward his car, his steps steady, his resolve unbroken. The echoes of music and broken whispers faded behind him until there was nothing but the sound of crickets and the crunch of stone beneath his shoes. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The past was behind him, sealed by Clara's voice, and his own silence finally broken. Ahead was something different. Not peace, not triumph, but the quiet knowledge that he had done what love required, even when it meant cruelty. Michael would rebuild, perhaps. He would try to salvage pride from ruin, to claw back status from shame. But no matter what came next, this night would haunt him. Every decision he made from here forward would be shadowed by the moment his mother's face appeared on a screen, and stripped him of illusion by the moment his father walked away, not beaten, but victorious. The wound would never fully close because it was not inflicted to destroy him. It was inflicted to save him if he chose to let it. That was the paradox of Richard's strike. It was punishment wrapped in mercy pain, delivered as proof that love can take shapes sharp enough to scar. The vineyard spread endlessly in front of Richard, the rows of vines like lines of scripture stretching into the night. He thought of Clara again, her voice urging him not to let their son drown in his own ambition. He thought of the boy Michael once was proud of, a father who stitched books back to life, and he wondered if that memory still lived somewhere beneath the rubble of arrogance. Perhaps one day Michael would find it again. Perhaps one day he would understand. But whether he did or not was no longer Richard's burden. He had given the lesson. The rest belonged to Michael. The stars burned brighter above ancient and unmoving. Richard opened his car door, slid behind the wheel, and started the engine. The headlights carved twin beams through the darkness, cutting across the vineyard road. He drove forward, the hall shrinking behind him, its noise lost to the distance. Ahead was only silence, the kind of silence that doesn't break a man, but rebuilds him. And as the road stretched on, Richard's words from the doorway seemed to echo again, carried into the night like a final benediction. Sometimes love is not protection. Sometimes love is the lesson that saves a soul from itself. And for anyone listening, for anyone watching, for anyone who ever believed that dignity outweighs wealth, the message was clear. If you have ever believed that integrity is worth more than money, that respect is richer than inheritance, then you understand what this night meant. Share it. Remember it. Let it remind you that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in character. And if you believe that too, don't just hold it in silence. Pass it on. Subscribe, speak, and stand by it. Because some lessons, the hardest ones, are the only ones that keep us whole. Life has a way of testing the values we hold most dear, especially in moments when pride and appearances try to overshadow love and respect. Richard's story reminds us that dignity is not something handed down. It is earned, and it must be defended even when it means making painful choices. True love for family is not always soft or protective. Sometimes it requires us to deliver hard lessons that protect a loved one from destroying themselves. As we grow older, we learn that silence can be mistaken for weakness, but wisdom lies in knowing when to stay quiet and when to speak with finality. Money, status, and applause from strangers fade quickly, but honor and integrity last long after the music stops. For those of us who have carried decades of sacrifice, it is important to remember that our worth is not measured by the recognition of others, but by the truth we live and the values we pass down. Sometimes the greatest act of love is not shielding others from consequences, but ensuring they learn from them. If you believe dignity is priceless and wisdom should never be forgotten, subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs its lesson.